Well, happy Sabbath, everyone. I decided I would make a video of my planned Sabbath school since we had a snow day today. Hopefully all of you have been having a fun time, maybe getting outside a little bit. Uh, the snow makes everything so pretty. It's been kind of exciting to have this little break. Today we're going to be talking about Genesis chapter 49, and I'm going to focus on verses 1 to 28. These are Jacob's last words. To start with, as I like to do, we have this painting by Harry Anderson. He's a famous Seventh-day Adventist painter who was born in 1906 and died in 1996. And he became a Seventh-day Adventist along with his wife in 1943. His paintings tend to focus on biblical themes, and he caught the attention of the Mormon Church, who very much liked his style, and they actually ended up commissioning him to do 30 different paintings for the Mormon Church on all kinds of different themes over the years. His first work was commissioned back in 1963. So that's kind of an interesting little connection between Adventists and Mormons sharing this painting. So when I was thinking about chapter 49, it sticks out to me that the form of this passage is in a poem. And poetry has always been considered a sign of more ancient parts of the Torah. We tend to take for granted writing. That's pretty much all we do for communication most of the time. But back in these biblical times of Jacob and Moses, writing was kind of a new technology, if you think about it. What do you write with? And what do you write on? It's not like there's pen and pencils and paper easily available. And then beyond that, there has to be a created written language, and then you have to learn how to write that spoken word, which very few people would have known how to do back then. So what does all this imply? Well, probably most of the Torah, or at least good sections of it, especially in Genesis, were passed from generation to generation for hundreds of years, verbally, not being written down. So these writings really originally were made to be spoken, not to be read, and that is a significant difference. It's kind of a different medium of communication. Example comes to mind is if you've ever heard Martin Luther King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream." Compare how that speech comes across to you if you were reading it versus watching or actually listening to Martin Luther King give the speech. So this poetic section of Genesis probably was passed down in an oral transmission for quite a while, and then at some point, traditionally Moses would have collected all these oral traditions together and actually written them down to become the Torah. Inspiration is the idea or the theory about how God transmitted the scriptures to the prophets or to the authors to write it down. And there's many different theories about this. There's the verbal dictation theory, which says that God dictated letter for letter, word for word, the entire Bible and the Torah. This is a view that the Orthodox Jews have about how Torah came to be. There's also the verbal plenary theory, and this idea is that God kind of providentially prepared the author's life and steered them in such a way that they became an instrument to produce Scripture. Then there's the intuition theory, and this idea is that biblical authors are just very wise men, and their writings are inspired in the sense that they're just advanced human insight with wisdom. Then there's the partial inspiration theory that states that the Bible is infallible when it comes to matters of faith and morals and religious practice, yet it could have errors in it regarding history and science. The dynamic inspiration theory, which I think the Adventist Church officially adopts, or similar to this anyway, is that the thoughts contained in the Bible are inspired by God, but the actual words that are written down and used were left to the individual writers to choose. There's another variation of inspiration called the incarnational inspiration model. This one is proposed by Alden Thompson in his book Inspiration. It's a really good book. I recommend that you read that. And his idea basically is Scripture is a combination of the fully human writer with the fully divine God, and that kind of mysterious incarnational situation happens, kind of similar to how Jesus was fully human and fully divine. All right, well, let's move on to Genesis 49 and talk about it a little bit. So these are the last words of Jacob before he dies. He has all of his sons surrounding him, and he's kind of giving them both blessings and prophecies of their future. It's the longest poem in Genesis. So as I talked about earlier, it is in kind of poetic or song form. The arrangement of who gets blessed first is kind of arranged by Jacob's wives. So Leah's sons are first, then there's Zilpah's sons and Bilhah's sons, and then final Rachel's two sons, Benjamin and Joseph. Reading through this biblical poem, you'll see that it's not just blessings of the sons, but there's also predictions for their future, and there's also kind of, I don't know if you want to call it curses, but there's some negative things as well based on the sons' previous history. So Jacob seems to have been carefully planning what he wanted to say, and perhaps he had this poem pre-planned or memorized so he could tell each of the sons at the proper time here when they were all together. When you read through each of Jacob's blessings, you will see there's kind of a stereotypical characterization of each tribe of Israel mixed in with what their future is going to be and how they're going to take part once they get to the promised land and start working together. There's a combination of taking the sons' history, how their lives went, and then kind of projecting that 100 years in the future when their descendants become the tribes of Israel and kind of take on that persona. I will post a translation of this passage on the Facebook page that you can download. I really like this 5 Books of Moses translation by Everett Fox. This is kind of a summary of his guiding principle about how he translated the Torah. What he tried to do is capture the original kind of structure and cadence and rhythm, how it would sound being passed verbally from generation to generation versus being read. And then he tries to use English words that kind of fit the Hebrew style and structure, so it makes it unique reading. It's not a perfect word-for-word translation. It's more of giving you the feel of like verbally how it would sound with the repetition and the alliterations and the word plays. And so I kind of like to read it just because it gives you a different feel. Here's an example, just the first couple verses from this translation. It also uses the official Hebrew names as well, which are a little different than we're used to. Now Yaakov called his sons and said, "Gather round, that I may tell you what will befall you in the aftertime of days. Come together and hearken, sons of Yaakov, hearken to Yisrael, your father." In verse 1 here, there's a famous phrase in this translation called aftertime of days. It's kind of talking about end times. So another way to translate it is in the latter days or in the days to come. And it's kind of saying more than just the future. It's kind of implying like the future of God's plan where the world will be saved and God will come back. It's kind of that end time type feeling, that phrase in the future. So this phrase in Hebrew occurs about 14 times, and I've listed here several of the different biblical verses that you can look it up where they apply. And this kind of adds to the prophetic feeling of this poem, and you can see that how the phrase has been used in other famous prophecies in the Old Testament. Another phrase in the poem that kind of stuck out to me is verse 18, "I wait in hope for your deliverance, O Yahweh." So this happens right after the blessing of Dan, and the Hebrew word for deliverance or salvation, how it's translated in many Bibles, is Yeshua, which is interesting because that's the Messiah, Jesus's Hebrew name, and that's the first time that Yeshua appears in the Bible. And it's also combined with hope and waiting and deliverance / salvation. So it kind of really expresses this intensity of hope for a future time when God will be fully connected back with his people. You'll also see that suddenly Jacob talks in the first person here, and he addresses God directly with his proper name, which is Yahweh. And this line comes right in the center of the blessing, which kind of gives it extra meaning. So I'd like to go on and talk about poetry a little bit. And to start with, maybe we'll just get some examples of non-biblical poetry. Creativity abounds when you set specific limitations or parameters. It's kind of interesting. You might think it would be the opposite, where if you really wanted to be creative, there would be no boundaries. But my observation is art does very well, and in fact needs boundaries to be done well. So for an example, in a Shakespearean sonnet, there's a specific structure that has to take place. Components of the sonnet are the iambic pentameter, the rhythm of each line. It's made up of 4 stanzas, 4 lines each. And the first and third lines rhyme together, and the second and fourth lines rhyme together, and then it ends with a rhymed couplet. So here's an example of a famous sonnet, number 18. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date." So there's an example of one type of poem that can be done. Let's look at another type of poem that's well known, the Japanese haiku poem. In this one, you have 3 lines. The first line is limited to 5 syllables, the second line 7 syllables, and the third line 5 syllables again. a famous example from the Japanese poet Matsuo Basho. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again. So I just give these some examples of how placing limits on how you write things kind of creates the poem. And Hebrew poetry in the Bible also has kind of its unique construction that you can look for. So often Hebrew poetry consists of 2 or 3 versets, kind of short phrases together, and each verset usually has 2 or 3 stresses in it. And the pattern of the poem is based more like on the meaning than the sound. We're used to English poems rhyming a lot. Hebrew poetry is different that way. And then the 2 or 3 versets kind of have a parallel meaning to each other. So here's an example from our Genesis 49. If you look at verse 15, this is in the blessing of Issachar. When he saw how good the resting place was and how pleasant was the land, he bent his shoulder to bearing and so became a laboring serf. So if you can see here, the first 2 lines or versets kind of parallel each other, talking about the good resting place, the pleasant land, and then the next 2 parallel each other too. Bending his shoulder to bearing, becoming a laboring serf. So you can see how they kind of work together in that structure. Another common structure that you find in the Bible is called chiastic structure. So I'm going to show you how that works in this passage. So this is just a quick chart to remind you that Jacob had 4 wives and the sons of each wife. And when you look at that and apply it to our verse, you'll find this structure here. So at the beginning of the poem, Jacob gathers his sons together, and then there's a quick prologue, which is verse 2. Then he goes through and blesses all of Leah's sons. Then Bilhah's first son is blessed. Then Zilpah's sons are blessed. And now you'll see the chiastic structure coming back. Then Bilhah's second son is blessed. Then Rachel's sons are blessed, paralleling Leah's sons above. Then there's an epilogue that matches with the prologue. And then there's a final summary of Israel gathering all his sons together as he dies. So you can kind of see that structure, how it reflects each other. That's called the chiastic structure, and you'll see this over and over in the Torah and quite frequently in Genesis. So I thought it would be kind of fun to create our own poems. If you're interested, I was going to do this in class, pass out some pen and paper and see what we could come up with. People could try to follow the pattern here of the biblical poetry in our passage here, or they could do a haiku, or for those that are really motivated, I'd be impressed if they could come up with a sonnet. But it's kind of a fun practice to think about doing this and then combining it with blessings like I talked about before. Blessings of your children, and you can, include their past history, their character, how they are, what blessings you'd like to tell for them, and maybe even project into the future some of the things you'd like to see happen for them as they live out their lives. Or it could be any loved one. It doesn't have to be a son or daughter, whatever you would like to pick, but it'd be kind of a fun, creative exercise to get you thinking about this poetic style that you run across frequently in the Torah. All right, so I will wrap up here just with a summary. Here's some questions to think about with this passage. When you look through the details of Jacob's prophecy, did they all come to pass as he predicted? And if they didn't all come to pass, how can you explain the fact that some of the prophecies were not precisely fulfilled? For an example, if you read through the blessing on Judah, he is supposed to be the tribe that ends up kind of being the monarchy class that are the kings. But interestingly enough, the first king of Israel ever, King Saul, was not from Judah. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. Another question, what purpose does this prophecy seem to serve the sons, because they're going to die long before they return to Canaan, hundreds of years in the future, and yet they're being told this kind of prediction of what's going to happen? How does that fit in? What do you think the sons would have thought about when they heard that? And why did Moses record the words of Jacob as he did here? What did Moses think that was valuable for writing down this ancient poem? Well, I hope all of you take some time to study this a little bit. I will also post both the translation that I was talking about, and also I will post all of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 if you want to read it. It's kind of a cool poem to read as well. So hope all of you have a great Sabbath. We look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll talk to you later.